Today's daf is daf Tzadi Ches, and we're in the middle of a sugya which began on Tzadi Zayin Amid Beis with regard to bittul b'shishim in the case of a mixture of eggs, of beitzim. And Rav Nachman taught us that, like other isurim, an egg that's prohibited is batel and shishim. And the Gemara objects and says, well, we have a principle that we derive from Rav Idi bar Ovin that an egg is tasteless. It doesn't have a tam. And therefore, why do you need shishim? The whole idea of bittul b'shishim is based on bittul tam. But in the case of the egg, there's no bittul. So the Gemara on the top of Tzadi Ches tries to answer that when we talk about shishim, we're talking about a beitzas efroach, which means an egg that has a chick inside of it. And as we discussed yesterday, the shechita, even if the bird is a kosher bird, does not impact on the efroach. And the efroach is basically considered like almost like a non-kosher egg. It has a life of its own, and it's prohibited. Now, there's a whole discussion here about whether it's doraisa or drabanan. We're going to leave that out right now. But the Gemara is going to say the following, that according to our interpretation that we're referring to a beitzas efroach, it means that the mother is a kosher bird, aval tmea lo. It would seem that Rav Nachman agrees that if it would have been a non-kosher bird and we found the egg inside of that bird, assuming that there's no efroach inside the egg, then according to Rav Nachman, you would not have the sinas tam, because, as we said before, an egg doesn't impart any flavor, and therefore doesn't require bittul, b'shishim, esvei. But we have a brayso that says beferish beitzim tahoros sheshlokon im beitzim tmeos, and again we require shishim. So that your interpretation that we're referring to a case of a chick, of an efroach, implying that if there was no efroach, then you would not require shishim, that's contradicted by this brayso, which says explicitly that if you have a mixture of two types of eggs from a kosher bird with eggs from a non-kosher bird, then everything depends upon shishim. Now, the assumption here in the Gemara now, at this point, is that even if there's no chick inside the egg, you would still require shishim. And that's against the principle that we mentioned before, that there's no nesinas tam in beitzim. So the Gemara says, Hachinami, I'm going to use the same answer that I used before, that the Bryce is not talking about a case where there's an egg without a chick in it, but rather the beitzas efrah. But now we have a problem, because if you're dealing with the beitzas efrah, we said that that's also even if the mother bird is kosher. And here in this price that we just quoted, the mixture was between beitzim taurus and beitzim tmeos. Tmeos meaning came from a non-kosher bird. Is therefore my correlate tmeo? Why do you classify this egg as tmea, meaning its mother was a non-kosher bird? It's irrelevant whether the mother was a kosher bird or a non-kosher bird, because even if the mother was a kosher bird, nevertheless, since there's a chick inside the egg, as we just said, then the afrach has a din of an avela, and it would generate an isur that requires shishim. So why mention that it came from a non-kosher bird? It's irrelevant whether the bird was kosher or non-kosher bird, because you're talking about a chick inside the egg, sorry. So the Gemara answers, "Kaven de isba efrach korele tmeya." The word tmeya is like a borrowed term. It really doesn't mean a non-kosher bird, but rather what it means is that since the chick inside the egg of this kosher bird is a nevela, it doesn't have a heter shchita, therefore it's like it's equal, it's equivalent to a non-kosher, a bird from a non, an egg from a non-kosher bird. So the Gemara is not happy with that either. We're going to look at the latter section of this brisa, and there it says that that ukimta, that there was an efrach inside the egg, we only have in the seifa. Apparently in the ratio, there was no efrach inside the egg. And therefore, im yesh bo benos in tam kulum asuros. Michlal, we can derive the conclusion by inference that Rachel lesle efrach askinon. And the Gemara answers perushi kama farish, that the seifa is not a separate presentation, but rather it's an interpretation of the Rachel. And the way that we're going to read this brisa in light of Perusha Kama Faresh is that the Resha is dealing with a case of a beitza from an oaf tahar, but inside the beitza there is an efroach, an unhatched chick. And the Seifa is now coming to tell you that, let's read it inside, beitzim tahoros, Sheshlokan in Beitzim Tmeos. And now we're talking about a case of a kosher bird. And we find an egg inside the kosher bird. And there's an efrach inside the egg. And then you mix it with other eggs. It's in Yesh Ba Benosein Tam. So again, when it says Beitzim Tmeos, we mean from an oaf tar, but there's an unhatched chick inside the egg. Kulan asuras ketzad kigon sheshlokam v'nimtzeh efrach b'achas miyim. So that again, the seifa is not a separate entity, and therefore we're going to be medayik from the seifa that it's a case of nimtza efrach b'echamim, inferring that the ratio is not nimtza efrach b'echamim. No. We're going to say that the ratio and the Sefer are both talking about Nimtza Efrach B'Achim, and the Sefer is coming to interpret the ratio. The Gemara wants to bring a support text to assume that the Sefer is now interpreting the ratio. If you're going to analyze this price and divide up the first part of the price from the second in a contrast the way we had it before, and we suggested that the ratio is a case where the egg itself came from a non-kosher bird, and therefore it's irrelevant as to whether or not there's an efrach inside, and the Sefer is talking about a case of a kosher bird, where we find an efrach inside. Is then I have a kasha, hashta de les be'efrach asura, this be'efrach mi boy. Why would the Bryce have to tell me in two separate segments and repeat that which is totally unnecessary if in the Reisha it doesn't have an Efroach? But why is it also because it came from a non-kosher bird? Then in the Sefer, you don't have to tell me that if there is an Efroach, whether it came from a kosher or non-kosher bird, it's irrelevant because the Efroach itself is also. So Gemara says that Hachinami Mistabra, that support analysis is not valid. Why? That doesn't really convince me. Again, it's very possible that there's a Reisha and a Seifa, and they should be contrasted one from the other. The Reisha teaching the case of a non-kosher bird, and the Seifa in the case of a kosher bird that has inside of it an Efrach. You're asking me, why did the Tana have to teach me this? Why couldn't I derive it from the Reisha? Tana Seifa l'gluya Reisha. We needed the Seifa, which is a case of an Efrach that came from a kosher bird, to teach me that the Reisha is talking about a non-kosher bird. Shalotoma Resha de Isbeafroach, that the only reason why in the Resha we required Shishim is because the egg had in it an unhatched chick. Is therefore Tani Seifa, therefore it says the Isbeafroach, and therefore we understand that the only reason why in the Seifa we required Bittul Atam with Shishim is because there was an Afroch inside. Mechlal, so now it would shed a light on the ratio less ba'afroach, and it has to be an egg of a non-kosher species, afilu hochi asir. So basically, if we want to summarize the bottom line of everything that we learned, there are two scenarios in which an egg needs bittul. One would be if the egg came from a treifa bird, and the other is where it came from a kosher bird, but it has an unhatched chick inside it. In both cases, the egg is asur, and if mixed with other eggs, it will generate an isur of tarovas isur. Now we remember that the word tarba is Aramaic for chelev. So hahu kzeisa, there was a whole kezaisras of chelev, did nafal b'dikula de bisra, and it fell into the pot of meat. Sava Rav, or somehow it's Rav Ashi, maybe l'shi'urei b'mai debola dikula. In other words, what about the pot itself? Meaning, as we discussed yesterday, the walls of the pot absorb the tam of that which is cooked inside the pot. And therefore, we have to, in calculating shishim to see if there's bittul tam, we have to also take into consideration the amount of food that you don't find. I'm sorry, the amount of heter that you don't find exactly in the pot, but some of that was absorbed into the walls of the pot. So therefore, when you're calculating shishim, there are going to be three numbers that have to be considered. Number one is the volume of the isur. Number two, let's look at all the heter that's in the pot and calculate its volume. And number three, the volume of the walls of the kli that have a capacity to absorb, maximum capacity to absorb the tam of heter. Now, there's a faulty logic over here. How can you calculate the walls, the maximum bli of the walls of the kedera when there was an iser that was cooked in that kedera? And to the same extent that the walls of the kedera absorbed a tam of heter, they also absorbed the tam of iser. So basically, it's the same ratio whether you calculate the walls or not. I don't get it. So how can you calculate the maximum absorption of the walls of the pot as if all that was absorbed into the walls of the pot is heter when you cooked iser in that pot, and to the same extent that the walls of the pot absorb the heter, they also absorb the iser. So basically, the Gemara's bottom line is that when we calculate shishim, all we have to consider is the be'en, the ratio between the volume of the is and the volume of the heter that's in the pot, that's being cooked in the pot, because the walls and their absorption is exactly the same ratio. Next, Hahu Palga de Zesa de Tarba, again, Tarba is Chelev. Palga de Zesa, now the chelev that was cooked was only half a zayis. Now, as far as half a zayis of chelev is concerned, we have a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish at the end of the Yoma, Masech the Yoma, where the chatzi shir osum in Torah or chatzi shir osum in Rabban. Right now, again, we're going to change it in just one line, but at this point in the sugya, we're assuming like Reish Lakish that Chatzi shir is only D'Rabbanan. And therefore, when you take a half of a zayis worth of chaylev and you cook it in a pot of heter, is Sava Mar Baravashi l'shirure betlosin palgi d'zeisa. You know what? We don't need shishim. All we need is 30. Why? Because since we're dealing with the D'Rabbanan, we could lower our standards, and instead of requiring a full 60 of heter to be mevatel the iser, we can mevatel the iser of a half a zayis of chaylev with 30 chatzi zaysim. Now, again, 30 chatzi zaysim and one chatzi zayis of chaylev is a ratio of 1 to 30, which is exactly half of what we require, and we're going to lower our standards because we're dealing with the D'Rabbanan. So Rav Ashi says to Mar Rav Ashi, Lava Minuchol Tizalsa Bishur D'Rabbanan. Now, it seems to me, this is based on my knowledge of a certain Nesivas HaMishpat, that what the Gemara is vacillating about is whether or not a D'Rabbanan is what we call a Hefta D'Isura. It has the same categorization or definition as an Isa Doraisa. And therefore, Rav Ashi says to Mar Rav Ashi, you know what? We're going to treat a D'Rabbanan exactly like a Doraisa. You have a Chatzi Zayis Chil. If owed, what about Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan holds Chatzi Shir Osam in Torah, and we're dealing with a Doraisa. So don't calculate with 30, 1 to 30, calculate with 1 to 60. There's a whole list of names here. We're going to skip it, and it's all in the name of Rabbi Yaakov. The Bei Nesia Amru, they all said, Beitza B'Shishim Asura. So until now, we've been assuming that the ratio to be Mavatil Iser is 1 to 60. 60 heter to 1 Iser. But now the Gemara says, no, we need Shishim V'Yachas, and then it's Muteris. It's got to be a ratio of 1 to 61. I'll just point out something historical. It seems that the halacha, when you open up the Shulchan Aruch today and you see Bittul B'Shishim, historically, chronologically, it developed over the course of generations, exactly how much you need to be Mavata. We're going to soon see that there's one sheet in the Gemara that you need 100 to 1 to be Mavata. Now we're talking about 61 to 1 to be Mavata. Rav Zerel Rav Shemin Bar Abba Re'esha Atamatil Bagvul Heter. In other words, you required 61 in order to apply bittul. Maybe what you mean is that we add the 1 kizayis of Isur in our calculation, and therefore, in order to get shishim, if we add the kizayis of Isur, we need shishim v'yachas. But you didn't spell that out for us. So maybe what you meant is that we're not going to calculate the kazayis of Isur. We need a full 61 heter. Sharei Shnei Gedolei Adolo Pirshos Adova. 2 of the greats did not really come to any decision. They weren't able to clarify this. Rav Yaakov Bar Idi, Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani, Travai Mishmei Rav Yeshua Ben Amri, Beisa B'Shishim Asura, B'Shishim V'Achas Muteris V'Boilahu, and we vacillated back and forth. What does this mean? Is it 1 against 60, or is it 1 against 61? Do you mean that if you calculate the Beitz Asura together with the other Beitzim, Hetera, then you'll need 61? Because only then will you have 60 against 1. O Dilma, perhaps, L'Bar Mineh. Forget about the Kizayis of Isur. You need 61 Kizayim of Heter in order to be mavata, v'lo poshet, and they never came to any conclusion. But mar poshet le mifshat. Apparently, when you said what you said, shishim v'yachas, it was quite clear to you what that means. And again, it might have been quite clear to you, but it's still very ambiguous. He says, Mar poshet le mifshat. For you, you understood, but people don't know exactly what you mean. Is it 61 including the egg that's also, or is it 61 minus the eggs that's also? And Rashi adds here that you should therefore have ended off your ruling by saying, but I do not know if the forbidden egg is included in the number 61 or not. Meaning, you should have pointed out that this is an outstanding vacillating point so that we don't come to any definite conclusion one way or the other. But the bottom line of the sugya is that it seems that this question remains unresolved. Itmar, Omrav Chelba, Omrav Huna, Beitza b'shishim v'hi asura. B'shishim v'yachas v'muteres. So we have a final conclusion on this whole discussion that we had until now. And the answer is that if you calculate the Beitz Asura together with the Shishim, and all you end up with is Shishim plus the Beitza, then it's Asura. But the Shishim v'achas v'muteres. Which means that you need, besides the Beitz Asura, you need 61. Now, there's a whole discussion here about whether or not this requirement of 61 is a separate halach in beitzim, when an egg gets mixed up or not, an iser beitza, beitz asura together with beitzim teres, or it applies to all isur. Now, what would be the basis of the assumption that this is only with regard to eggs? He says that eggs come in varying sizes. So how you meshar b'shishim? You'd have to measure each individual egg to ensure that the prohibited egg is not slightly larger than the permitted eggs, the average permitted eggs. This is not practical. And therefore, the Rabbanan added an extra egg to get to 61 to compensate for any size discrepancy between the prohibited egg and the average of permitted eggs. So then it becomes a besudra halacha in beitzim, but otherwise shishim is enough. Hahudi also coming to Rav Gamliel bar Rebbe. Okay, something got cooked, and it was Iser and Heter, and apparently they were matered with 45. Amalei, so Gamliel says, Abalo Shir bar Bon V'Sheva. My father Rebbe would not even allow you to nullify, to be mavata with 47. Vani Ashar bar Bon V'Chamesh. Can I use 45? For sure not. Again, it doesn't clarify what is the exact number of bittul. What is the ratio? 47 is not enough. Maybe 48 is enough. Maybe 50. Maybe 60. I don't know. All this is developing over the course of Doros. And again, with the Gemara now repeats itself, Rebbe and Amalei. Again, according to this variation, it was 43 or 45. We don't know. But 45 is not enough. Hodi asel kami de Rabbi Chia, amalei klum yesh shloshim. Rabbi Chia held that all you need is shloshim. You don't even need shishim. And the Gemara says, time of the, apparently, Rabbi Chia said, unless you have shloshim, it's also. Ha'ika shloshim sharim, then it would be bottle with shloshim. Rabbi Chia Guzma. He didn't mean to say that shloshim would be enough. He was like saying it, oh, shloshim? He was being sarcastic. Would shloshim be enough? Obviously, shloshim is not enough. How much do you need? 43, 45, 60? Bar kapara is a tana, kol isun shebetor b'shishim. Any isa that's minat Torah requires shishim for bittul. Amal lefan Rab Shmuel bar Yitzchak. Rebbe ata omer came. So you're saying in the name of Rabbi Shur ben Levi, the name of Bar Kapar, that 60 is bittul. I have a different tradition that traces us to Rabbi Shur ben Levi in the name of Bar Kapar. Not enough to have 60, you need 100. And later on in Amid Beis, we're going to see how they calculated either 60 or 100 and what the source of the issue is all about. And we start that sugya. Let me just give a little introduction here. It's called Zroa B'Sheila. So what's Zroa B'Sheila? When a Nazir completes his Nazirus, the Torah mandates that the Nazir has to bring an aisle, a ram, I think it's called in English, right? An aisle. Now, this aisle has two parts to it. It has the zroa, right, which is the arm, and the rest of the aisle. And herein lies the difference. The zroa has a kind of kochim status in that it's only mutter to kohanim, and a non-kohen is not allowed to eat it. The rest of the aisle is a shlamim, like any other shlamim. It can be eaten by Yisrael. But the Torah says, Ra b'shela b'aisle, that you have to cook the aisle. Again, we're going to have different shitos here, but let me say, according to one shita, you have to cook it whole. Whole meaning together with the zroa. Now, when you cook it together with the zroa, you've got a problem. The zroa, since it's also to Yisrael and on Kohen, now gives off its tam through the bishul process in the rest of the aisle, which is shlom, that's mutal Yisrael. How could the Yisrael eat it if it has the tam of the zroa, and if the zroa is something that's also to the Yisrael, a quasi kochim status? So apparently, if the Torah allows you to cook the aisle in its entirety with the zroa inside, it must be that there's a bittul situation going over here where the flavor that comes out, let's say emitted by the zroa, is nullified by the aisle itself, so that the rest of the aisle could be eaten by Yisrael. And now we have to calculate the ratio between the volume of the zroa and the volume of the rest of the aisle. Shneim lo lamdu mizroa b'shela. T'chsiv v'lakach hakohen says zroa b'shela. Let's see if we can read the rest of the pasuk here. Mina ayah. So you see the word b'shela. That's the key word here. B'shela. V'tanya, we learned in the Brisa. What does the word b'shela mean? By the way, I said the word zroa means an arm, but an animal like a ram in this case doesn't have an arm. The arm is its foreleg, just to get the record straight.